On a vibrant summer day, the bustling city of Riverdale buzzed with life. The sun hung high in a clear blue sky, casting its golden rays over the community pool, where families and friends gathered to escape the oppressive heat. Laughter and splashes echoed through the air as people reveled in the simple joy of a refreshing swim. Among the swimmers was Michael, a young African-American man in his mid-20s. His toned, muscular frame cut effortlessly through the water as he swam with graceful, powerful strokes. Michael had always loved swimming. It was his sanctuary, a way to connect with his inner peace amidst the chaos of urban life. Unbeknownst to Michael, seated on a nearby poolside lounger was Elaine, a middle-aged white woman who lived in the same neighborhood. She sipped her icy drink, watching the pool's activities with a sharp, critical eye. Elaine had earned a reputation for her strong opinions, often laced with underlying biases she seldom acknowledged even to herself. Her upbringing had been steeped in prejudice, a subtle but persistent thread woven into her view of the world. When her gaze fell on Michael, gliding effortlessly through the water, a shadow of disapproval clouded her face. She narrowed her eyes and frowned slightly, unsettled by his presence. In her mind, Elaine clung to the outdated belief that people like Michael didn't belong in what she considered her community spaces. She had never confronted these thoughts outright, but they surfaced in moments like this, unbidden and unapologetic. She convinced herself that her discomfort was justified, though she couldn't quite articulate why. As Michael continued swimming, blissfully unaware of her scrutiny, Elaine's unease grew, a knot tightening in her chest. The pool became busier as the afternoon stretched on. Families of various ethnicities arrived, spreading colorful towels on the deck and unpacking pool toys. Children squealed with delight as they splashed in the shallow end, and teenagers challenged each other to cannonball contests. The growing diversity of the crowd only heightened Elaine's discomfort. She shifted in her seat, her drink now warm and forgotten, her mind clouded with a simmering sense of indignation. To her, the pool, once a symbol of her community, seemed unfamiliar and even threatening. Michael, meanwhile, had finished his swim and was resting at the pool's edge, his breathing calm and even. He relished the simple pleasure of being surrounded by water, his senses attuned to the gentle lap of waves against the pool walls and the hum of conversation around him. He wiped the water from his face and leaned back, letting the sun warm his skin. The afternoon had been everything he hoped for, a peaceful escape from the demands of daily life. But the serenity of the moment was shattered by a sudden, piercing cry. A woman's voice rang out from the deep end of the pool, her plea for help cutting through the noise. Gasps and shouts rippled through the crowd as people turned to see what was happening. In an instant, Michael was on his feet. His lifeguard training from his college days kicked in, and without a second thought, he dove into the water. His powerful strokes propelled him toward the commotion with purpose and urgency. Elaine, startled by the cry for help, sat upright, her heart racing. She scanned the pool and spotted the source of the distress, a woman flailing in the deep end, her head barely staying above water. The sight was both terrifying and surreal. As her eyes followed the unfolding rescue, she realized with a jolt that it was Michael who had leapt into action. Her discomfort transformed into a strange mix of shock and disbelief. The young man she had silently judged all afternoon was now the hero of the moment. Michael reached the struggling swimmer in seconds. He wrapped a firm but gentle arm around her and began guiding her back toward the pool's edge, his movements confident and practiced. The crowd watched in tense silence, their focus locked on the drama unfolding before them. The woman, still gasping for air, clung to Michael as he reassured her with calm, steady words. By the time they reached the shallow end, her panic had subsided, replaced by a shaky relief. As Michael helped the woman out of the water, applause erupted from the onlookers. The tension in the air dissipated, replaced by admiration and gratitude for Michael's quick thinking. The woman, visibly shaken but unharmed, looked up at her rescuer with wide eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know what happened. I couldn't keep my head above the water." Michael smiled gently, offering her a towel. "I'm glad I could help," he said. "Do you feel okay? Do you need medical attention?" The woman shook her head, her breath still coming in uneven bursts. "No, I'm fine," she replied. "Just a bit shaken, that's all." As the crowd began to disperse, returning to their towels and conversations, Elaine remained frozen in her seat. She had watched the entire scene play out, her emotions churning. Part of her felt a grudging respect for Michael's bravery, but another part, the deeper, darker part, refused to let go of her biases. She struggled to reconcile the image of the man who had just saved a life with the preconceived notions she harbored about people like him. Her mind raced, searching for a way to diminish the weight of what she had witnessed. Michael, sensing the woman's lingering unease, extended a hand to help her stand. His gesture was simple, kind, and natural, yet it triggered something visceral in Elaine. She flinched, recoiling as if his touch carried danger. Her eyes widened, and her expression twisted into one of fear and disgust. "Don't touch me," she snapped, her voice sharp and accusatory. Michael froze, his hand retracting as if stung. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice calm but tinged with confusion. "I was just trying to help you up." Elaine's lips curled into a sneer, her gaze fixed on him with a hostility that seemed to surprise even herself. "I don't need your help," she said coldly, brushing off her legs and standing on her own. Michael stepped back, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. He nodded politely and turned away, retreating to the poolside where he had been resting earlier. His expression was composed, but inside, a familiar sting of hurt and frustration simmered. He had encountered reactions like this before, moments where his actions, no matter how noble, were overshadowed by someone's prejudices. Elaine watched him go, her heart pounding. Her initial gratitude for Michael's intervention had been overshadowed by an uncomfortable truth. His heroism had challenged everything she believed about people like him. Yet, instead of confronting her biases, she clung to them even tighter, using them as a shield against the cognitive dissonance she felt. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the pool, Elaine remained seated, her drink untouched. Around her, the sounds of joy and laughter continued, a testament to the vibrant diversity of the community. But within her, a storm raged, a conflict between the prejudices she had always accepted as truth and the undeniable reality of Michael's selflessness. Michael, meanwhile, resumed his place at the pool's edge, his expression calm but his mind elsewhere. He had saved a life that day, yet the sting of rejection lingered. Still, he refused to let it overshadow the peace he had come to find. For Michael, the water was a sanctuary, a place where he could rise above the turbulence of the world around him, even on days like this. The sunny tranquility of the poolside had dissolved into chaos. Michael, still reeling from the venom in Elaine's voice, stood motionless as her words echoed in his ears. "Help me," she spat, her face contorted with fury. "How dare you lay your hands on me, you?" Her voice was shrill, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd that had gathered. A ripple of unease spread among the onlookers, their faces a mixture of confusion and wariness. Some in the crowd instinctively shifted closer to Elaine, their glances at Michael tinged with suspicion. Others, unsure of what to believe, exchanged nervous whispers. Michael's heart raced. He tried to process what was happening, struggling to reconcile the venomous accusations with the moment of heroism just minutes earlier when he had saved Elaine from drowning. Elaine's tirade escalated, her words sharp and unforgiving. "You think you can just swoop in and play the hero, don't you? Well, I see right through your little act, you filthy." Her words were cut off as a young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, stepped forward from the crowd. "Excuse me, ma'am," the woman interjected, her tone calm yet firm. "I saw what happened. This young man saved your life. He didn't do anything wrong." Elaine's head snapped toward the woman, her face darkening with anger. "Stay out of this," she hissed, her voice trembling with indignation. "You don't know what you're talking about." The tension in the air was thick, the crowd growing uneasy. Some shuffled uncomfortably, while others looked at Michael with fresh skepticism, their own biases bubbling to the surface. For Michael, the scene felt surreal. The energy of gratitude and relief he had felt after saving Elaine had evaporated, replaced by a suffocating sense of dread. He realized, with mounting fear, that the tide of the crowd's perception was turning against him. Elaine, emboldened by the murmurs of support from a few in the crowd, pressed on, her voice rising in both volume and venom. "You think you can just come here and take advantage of me? Don't you?" she spat, pointing an accusing finger at Michael. "I know you're kind. I won't be a victim of your sick games." Michael felt his pulse quicken as he stood frozen in disbelief. "Ma'am," he began, his voice steady but strained, "I assure you I was only trying to help. I'm a trained lifeguard and I saw you were in trouble. I acted to save you, nothing more." "Shut up," Elaine screeched, cutting him off mid-sentence. Her eyes burned with rage and her voice grew louder, more erratic. "I don't want to hear your lies. You're all the same. Filthy animals thinking you can do whatever you want. But not here, not in my community." The crowd fell silent, stunned by the intensity of Elaine's accusations. Some exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable, while others nodded in agreement, their own prejudices silently fueling their alignment with Elaine. The hostility in the air was palpable, a heavy weight pressing down on Michael as he struggled to find the words to defend himself. Michael, still trying to process the surreal turn of events, attempted once more to defuse the situation. "Ma'am, please," he said, his voice tinged with desperation. "Let's just calm down and talk this through. I truly mean you no harm." Before he could finish, Elaine let out a blood-curdling scream, her voice piercing and raw. She stumbled backward dramatically, her arms flailing as though trying to ward off an attacker. "Help! Help!" she cried, her voice trembling with exaggerated fear. "This man is attacking me." The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Several bystanders, galvanized by Elaine's cries, surged forward, their faces a mixture of outrage and alarm. Some moved to surround Michael, their stances aggressive, while others began shouting accusations. "Call the police," someone yelled. "Don't let him get away." Michael's eyes widened in disbelief as he raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Wait. No, you don't understand," he pleaded, his voice nearly drowned out by the growing commotion. "I saved her life. I didn't do anything wrong." But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The crowd's emotions had been ignited, their fear and bias stoked by Elaine's performance. A few bystanders began to physically restrain Michael, their hands gripping his arms and shoulders despite his lack of resistance. "Please," he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of his desperation. "You've got it all wrong." Elaine, watching the scene unfold with a twisted sense of satisfaction, continued to wail and cry, her voice dripping with false anguish. "Officers! Someone call the police," she shouted, her words echoing across the pool deck. "He tried to hurt me." "He tried to," she choked on her own words, her tears carefully manufactured to sell her story. In the distance, the wail of approaching sirens grew louder, the flashing lights of police vehicles visible beyond the pool's entrance. Michael's heart sank at the sight, the reality of his situation crashing down on him like a tidal wave. He had gone from hero to villain in the blink of an eye, his act of kindness twisted into something sinister by Elaine's lies and the crowd's prejudices. The police arrived moments later, their presence cutting through the chaotic energy of the scene. The crowd parted to allow the officers access, their murmurs hushed as they watched the situation unfold. Michael stood at the center of it all, his hands still raised in surrender, his face a mask of disbelief and fear. Elaine wasted no time. She rushed toward the officers, her expression a mix of feigned relief and hysteria. "Officers," she cried, pointing a trembling finger at Michael. "Thank goodness you're here. This man, he attacked me." "He tried to," she paused, her voice breaking as though the memory was too painful to recount. "He tried to assault me?" Michael's jaw dropped, the weight of her words hitting him like a physical blow. "No. That's not true," he shouted, his voice hoarse with desperation. "I saved her life. I pulled her out of the water. Ask anyone." But his protests were drowned out by Elaine's sobs and the murmurs of the crowd. The officers, their expressions unreadable, turned to Michael, their eyes scanning his face and body language. One of them stepped forward, gesturing for Michael to lower his hands. "Sir, we need you to remain calm," the officer said, his tone firm but not hostile. "We're going to need to ask you some questions." Michael nodded, his movements slow and deliberate. "I am calm," he said, his voice trembling. "But I swear I didn't do anything wrong. I only wanted to help her." As the officers began taking statements from Elaine and the crowd, Michael stood silently, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on him, the biases of the onlookers clouding the truth of what had happened. He knew that proving his innocence would be an uphill battle, one that might cost him not just his reputation but his freedom. In that moment, Michael resolved to fight, for himself, for the truth, and for the principle that no one should be condemned on the basis of lies and prejudice. But as he looked around at the faces of the crowd, their expressions a mix of pity, skepticism, and hostility, he couldn't help but wonder if justice would ever truly prevail. The sunny afternoon that had begun with a heroic act now spiraled into an unjust nightmare. Michael, still reeling from Elaine's vicious accusations, found himself at the mercy of the officers who had arrived at the poolside scene. Their expressions were tense, their hands hovering near their holstered weapons as they approached him with caution. "Sir, please step away from the woman and put your hands behind your back," one officer commanded in a stern voice that brooked no argument. Michael's heart pounded in his chest. His mind raced, grasping for the right words to explain the truth of what had happened. But he knew that any resistance, even a verbal protest, might escalate the already volatile situation. Swallowing his pride and fear, he complied, raising his hands slowly and turning around. As he felt the cold steel of handcuffs bite into his wrists, a crushing sense of disbelief settled over him. The crowd erupted in a cacophony of reactions. Some cheered Elaine on, shouting words of encouragement to the woman they believed to be a victim. Others watched in uneasy silence, their expressions betraying doubt about the speed and severity of the officer's actions. Michael, his head held high despite the humiliation, tried one last time to reason with those around him. "Please, you have to listen to me," he pleaded, his voice trembling with urgency. "I saved this woman's life. I'm a trained lifeguard. She was drowning and I—" "Enough," one of the officers barked, cutting him off. His words were sharp, final. Michael felt a wave of despair wash over him as he was led to the waiting police car, the murmurs of the dispersing crowd a cruel backdrop to his fading protests. From her place among a group of supporters, Elaine watched with a triumphant smirk. The narrative she had woven, an elaborate fabrication born of prejudice, had taken root. Around her, people murmured words of reassurance, reinforcing her version of events. Yet a few bystanders lingered, their gazes flickering between Elaine and the departing police car, their consciences uneasy. Michael sat in the back seat of the police car, his wrists aching from the tightness of the cuffs. Through the barred windows, he could see the pool and the crowd shrinking into the distance. A heavy silence enveloped him, broken only by the hum of the engine. His mind raced with questions. How had this gone so wrong? How could an act of bravery have led to such an egregious miscarriage of justice? By the time they arrived at the police station, Michael's determination to prove his innocence had crystallized, though the weight of the situation bore down on him. He was led inside, his shoulders squared but his heart heavy. The process that followed felt like a humiliating blur. He was fingerprinted, photographed, and questioned by officers who seemed already convinced of his guilt. Each procedural step deepened the pit in his stomach. In the sterile interrogation room, Michael sat across from two officers. One, a gruff-looking man with a thick mustache, leaned forward with an air of skepticism. The other, a younger officer with a softer demeanor, remained silent, jotting down notes. "Let's start from the top," the older officer said, his tone clipped. "You're saying you didn't attack this woman?" "I didn't," Michael insisted, his voice steady despite the mounting frustration. "I saved her. She was struggling in the deep end of the pool. I'm a trained lifeguard, I've done rescues before. This was no different." The officer arched a skeptical brow. "That's not what she's telling us. She claims you assaulted her after pulling her out of the water. And we've got witnesses backing her story." Michael's heart sank. Witnesses? How could anyone have seen an attack that never happened? "Those witnesses didn't see the truth," he said firmly. "I didn't harm her. I risked my life to save her." The younger officer glanced up from his notes, his expression unreadable. "Why do you think she's accusing you then?" Michael hesitated. The truth, that Elaine's accusations stemmed from deeply rooted prejudice, was a hard thing to articulate, especially to people who might share her biases. "I don't know," he said at last, his voice tinged with frustration. "Maybe she was scared. Confused. But I didn't do anything wrong." The older officer leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "Look, son. We're just trying to get to the bottom of this. But right now the evidence doesn't look good for you. Unless you've got something concrete, security footage, a credible witness, this isn't going to go in your favor." Michael's chest tightened. Security footage? Witnesses? He had neither. All he had was the truth, and it seemed that wasn't enough. As the hours dragged on, the questions grew sharper, more pointed. Michael answered them all, his recollection of the events unwavering. Yet every response seemed to fall on deaf ears, the officer's skepticism unwavering. By the time they escorted him to a holding cell, he felt a profound sense of betrayal. The cold, barren cell was a stark contrast to the vibrant poolside scene where this nightmare had begun. Michael sat on the hard bench, his head bowed. He replayed the events over and over in his mind, searching for some detail, some overlooked fact that might help clear his name. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the crushing weight of Elaine's lies. Back at the station's front desk, Elaine sat surrounded by a small group of supporters. She recounted her fabricated story with dramatic flair, her voice quivering with feigned vulnerability. "He grabbed me," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "I thought I was going to drown, but then, he turned on me. I was so scared." The officers listening to her nodded solemnly, their expressions grim. Her story, though riddled with inconsistencies, had been bolstered by a handful of onlookers at the pool who had misconstrued the chaotic scene. Her narrative had solidified, and with it, the perception of Michael as a villain. Yet among the crowd at the pool and even within the station, whispers of doubt began to stir. Some had seen Michael's genuine act of heroism and were troubled by Elaine's accusations. A young woman who had witnessed the rescue firsthand debated coming forward, her heart heavy with the knowledge that an innocent man was being vilified. But fear held her back, the weight of the crowd's prejudice silencing her voice. For Michael, the night stretched on in agonizing stillness. He stared at the barred window of his cell, the moonlight casting long shadows on the cold floor. The questions swirling in his mind were relentless. Would anyone believe him? Could he prove his innocence in a system stacked against him? Though his situation felt hopeless, a flicker of resolve burned within him. He had faced the depths of despair and the sting of injustice, but he refused to let Elaine's lies define his life. Somewhere, somehow, the truth would come to light. And when it did, Michael vowed to ensure that no one else would ever endure what he was now facing. The weight of the cuffs around Michael's wrists felt heavier with every passing second as the police car navigated the busy streets. The events of the last hour swirled chaotically in his mind. What had begun as a selfless act of saving a life had inexplicably transformed into a nightmare of false accusations and betrayal. Staring out the window, Michael struggled to reconcile what had happened. His hands, the very ones that had pulled Elaine from the water, were now restrained as though they had committed a crime. The officer driving the car offered no comfort, his silence thick with unspoken judgment. Michael's thoughts turned inward. How had it come to this? He replayed the incident over and over, searching for the moment everything had gone wrong. He had seen Elaine struggling in the pool, her head dipping below the water. Without hesitation he had jumped in, driven by training and instinct. And now, that same instinct had landed him here, in handcuffs, accused of a heinous crime he didn't commit. The suffocating feeling of injustice grew stronger. Michael thought of his family, imagining their shock and pain when they learned of what had transpired. Would they believe him? Would his friends, the community he had always strived to protect and uplift, stand by him? Or would Elaine's malicious accusations and the prejudices of society overshadow the truth? By the time the car arrived at the police station, Michael's resolve had begun to harden. He didn't know how he would prove his innocence, but he knew he couldn't let despair consume him. The officers opened the car door and guided him inside, their grip firm but impersonal. The bustling activity of the station was a harsh contrast to the isolation Michael felt. Heads turned briefly as they passed, some officers glancing at him with curiosity, others with subtle disdain. Michael was processed with cold efficiency. His fingerprints taken, his photographs snapped under harsh fluorescent lights. The metallic click of the handcuffs being removed was a brief relief, though it was short-lived. He was immediately led to an interrogation room. The bare walls and stark lighting only amplified his sense of vulnerability. Two officers entered, one older with a thick mustache and a hardened expression, the other younger, who seemed less certain but no less determined. They sat across from Michael, their presence heavy with implied authority. "All right," the older officer said, leaning forward. "Tell us what happened." Michael took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "I was at the pool," he began, his voice steady. "I saw a woman struggling in the water. She looked like she was drowning. I'm a trained lifeguard, so I jumped in to help. I pulled her to safety. That's all I did." The officer's eyes narrowed. "That's not what the victim claims. She says you assaulted her after pulling her out." Michael's stomach churned. "That's not true," he said firmly. "I didn't lay a hand on her except to help. I would never hurt anyone." The younger officer scribbled something in a notebook, his gaze flicking between Michael and his partner. "Why do you think she'd say that if it's not true?" he asked. Michael hesitated, aware of how carefully he needed to tread. "I don't know," he said slowly. "Maybe she was confused. Or maybe there's something else going on. But I swear to you, I didn't do anything wrong." The older officer leaned back, crossing his arms. "We've got multiple witnesses backing her story. You're telling us they're all lying?" Michael blinked, taken aback. "Witnesses? I don't know what they think they saw, but I didn't do anything wrong. I saved her." The skepticism in the room was palpable. "Look," the older officer said, "this isn't looking good for you. If you've got evidence or someone to vouch for you, now's the time to bring it up." Michael's frustration bubbled to the surface. "I don't have evidence," he snapped. "All I have is the truth. Isn't that supposed to matter?" The officers exchanged a glance, the older one's expression hardening while the younger seemed to falter. After what felt like an eternity, they stood, signaling the end of the interrogation. Michael was escorted to a holding cell, the cold metal bench inside a harsh reminder of his predicament. Sitting alone in the cell, Michael felt despair creep in. He thought of the people at the pool, wondering if anyone had truly seen what happened. Surely someone must have noticed his heroic act. But would they come forward? Would they speak up against the tidal wave of Elaine's lies? Unbeknownst to Michael, a few of those bystanders were grappling with the very same questions. At the pool, a young woman who had seen the incident from start to finish wrestled with her conscience. She had watched Michael dive into the water and pull Elaine to safety. She had seen Elaine lash out at him almost immediately, her accusations ringing false to anyone paying attention. And yet, fear had kept the young woman silent. But as she watched Michael being led away in handcuffs, the injustice of the situation became too much to bear. Gathering her courage, she made her way to the police station. There, she found others who had also witnessed the truth and shared her unease about Elaine's story. Slowly, they began to speak up, recounting the events as they had seen them. They described Michael's swift and selfless actions, his obvious concern for Elaine's safety. Their accounts painted a starkly different picture from the one Elaine had offered. As the testimonies poured in, the officers who had dismissed Michael's claims began to take notice. The younger officer, in particular, seemed troubled by the growing disparity between Elaine's account and those of the bystanders. The older officer, though slower to concede, couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. Back in his cell, Michael remained unaware of the shift occurring outside. His thoughts were heavy with uncertainty and fear. He wondered if he would ever see justice, if the truth would ever be heard. But as the hours ticked by, the tide was turning. One by one, the witnesses' voices began to chip away at the foundation of Elaine's lies. Their unwavering accounts forced the authorities to reconsider their initial assumptions. The narrative Elaine had so confidently crafted was unraveling, exposing the prejudice and malice that had fueled her accusations. When an officer finally approached Michael's cell, his expression was markedly different. There was no longer the cold detachment of someone convinced of guilt. Instead, there was a flicker of regret. As the door creaked open, Michael's heart raced. "You've got people speaking up for you," the officer said gruffly. "We're taking another look at things." For the first time since the nightmare began, hope bloomed in Michael's chest. It wasn't over yet, but the truth was finally being given a chance to shine. And as he stepped out of the cell, his resolve only strengthened. He would fight not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by injustice. The battle was far from over, but Michael was ready to see it through to the end. The sunny afternoon that had begun with a heroic act now spiraled into an unjust nightmare. Michael, still grappling with the gravity of Elaine's vicious accusations, found himself surrounded by officers who had arrived at the poolside. Their stern expressions and cautious movements spoke volumes, as if he were a dangerous criminal rather than a man who had just saved a life. Their hands hovered near their holstered weapons as they slowly approached, their suspicion palpable. "Sir, step away from the woman and put your hands behind your back," one officer commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. Michael's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing as he struggled to process the unfolding chaos. Just moments ago, he had been hailed as a hero by some in the crowd after pulling Elaine from the pool. Now, however, the scene had shifted entirely. He glanced at Elaine, who was now surrounded by sympathetic onlookers, tears streaming down her face as she clutched a towel around her shoulders. The words she had spat out moments earlier echoed in his mind. "He attacked me." Michael opened his mouth to protest but quickly realized how precarious the situation had become. Resistance, even in the form of verbal objections, could escalate matters dangerously. He raised his hands slowly, his movements deliberate, and turned around. As the officer closed the distance and snapped cold steel handcuffs onto his wrists, a sharp pang of disbelief shot through him. How had things gone so horribly wrong? The crowd around the pool murmured and shifted uneasily. Some cheered Elaine on, emboldened by her claims, while others exchanged uncertain glances. A few bystanders whispered amongst themselves, their expressions betraying a mixture of doubt and discomfort at the officer's swift action. Michael, his dignity unraveling with each step toward the police car, tried to reason one last time with those around him. "Please," he called out, his voice trembling but resolute. "You've got to listen to me. I didn't do anything wrong. I saved her, she was drowning. I'm a trained lifeguard." "Enough," barked the officer behind him, cutting off his words with a tone of finality. Michael stumbled slightly as he was led toward the car, his protest swallowed by the murmurs of the dispersing crowd. From her vantage point among her supporters, Elaine watched the scene unfold with a self-satisfied smirk tugging at her lips. She basked in the attention, her voice carrying easily over the noise as she recounted her fabricated story to anyone who would listen. Around her, people nodded and murmured their agreement, their faces painted with expressions of sympathy. Yet not everyone was convinced. A few bystanders lingered at the edges of the dispersing crowd, their gazes flickering between Elaine's dramatic performance and the departing police car that carried Michael away. Doubts gnawed at them, but fear of going against the grain kept them silent. Inside the police car, Michael sat rigid in the back seat, his wrists aching from the unforgiving tightness of the cuffs. Through the barred window, he could still see the pool shrinking into the distance, the scene of his humiliation fading but not disappearing from his mind. The hum of the engine was the only sound that filled the tense silence. His thoughts raced, replaying every moment, searching for some explanation or clarity. How could such a selfless act, jumping into the water to save Elaine, lead to this? How could the truth have been so easily buried under lies? By the time they arrived at the police station, the disbelief that had gripped Michael earlier had hardened into a quiet resolve. He knew that proving his innocence would not be easy. The system, with all its biases and preconceived notions, had already begun treating him as guilty. Still, he refused to let despair claim him. Squaring his shoulders, he allowed himself to be led inside, his chin held high despite the humiliation. The station was a flurry of activity, but to Michael, it felt suffocatingly small. He was processed with cold efficiency, photographed, fingerprinted, and catalogued in a way that made him feel like less of a person and more of a case number. The indignity of it all burned in his chest, but he held his tongue, aware that any sign of anger or frustration could be misconstrued. Eventually he was escorted to a bare interrogation room. A steel table and two uncomfortable chairs awaited him, the overhead light casting harsh shadows on the walls. Michael was seated, his cuffs removed but his wrists still marked by their unforgiving grip. Across from him sat two officers. One, an older man with a thick mustache and a skeptical gaze, leaned forward, his posture intimidating. The other, younger and less assured, sat back with a notebook in hand, observing quietly. "All right," the older officer began, his voice clipped and authoritative. "Let's start from the beginning. You're telling us you didn't attack this woman?" "I didn't," Michael said, his tone firm but not combative. "I saved her. She was drowning in the pool. I pulled her out. That's all I did." The older officer raised a skeptical brow. "That's not what she's saying. According to her, you assaulted her after pulling her out of the water. And we've got witnesses who back her story." Michael's stomach churned at the mention of witnesses. How could anyone have seen an assault that never happened? His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. "Those witnesses must be mistaken," he said, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. "I didn't harm her. I risked my life to save hers." The younger officer finally spoke, his voice measured. "Why do you think she's accusing you then?" Michael hesitated, the weight of the question bearing down on him. The answer, that Elaine's accusations were rooted in prejudice, felt too dangerous to voice openly. "I don't know," he said at last. "Maybe she's confused. Maybe she panicked. But I swear to you, I didn't do anything wrong." The older officer leaned back, crossing his arms as he scrutinized Michael. "Look, son," he said, his tone verging on condescension. "This doesn't look good for you. Unless you've got evidence to back up your story, security footage, a credible witness, this is going to be a tough case to fight." Michael felt a pang of helplessness. Security footage? Witnesses? He had neither. All he had was the truth, and it seemed that wasn't enough. He answered their questions as best he could, recounting the events with unwavering consistency. But their skepticism lingered, heavy and oppressive. Hours later, Michael was led to a holding cell. The cold, metallic bench inside was a stark reminder of how precarious his situation had become. Alone with his thoughts, he replayed every moment of the incident, searching for some overlooked detail that could prove his innocence. But the truth was simple and unembellished. He had saved Elaine from drowning. That truth, however, now seemed fragile against the weight of Elaine's lies and the prejudices of the system. Meanwhile, back at the station's front desk, Elaine continued her theatrical performance. Surrounded by a small group of supporters, she recounted her story with dramatic pauses and trembling words, painting herself as a victim of a senseless attack. "I thought I was going to drown," she said, her voice quivering. "And then he grabbed me. I was terrified." Her narrative, though riddled with inconsistencies, was bolstered by a few onlookers who had misinterpreted the chaotic scene at the pool. But not everyone was convinced. A young woman who had witnessed the rescue firsthand wrestled with her conscience. She had seen Michael's actions clearly, his courage and determination to save a life. Now, as she watched Elaine's lies solidify into a damning story, the weight of remaining silent pressed heavily on her. Inside his cell, Michael stared at the barred window, the moonlight casting pale streaks across the floor. His mind churned with questions, doubts, and fears. Could he prove his innocence? Would anyone come forward to speak the truth? Or would Elaine's accusations define the rest of his life? Yet even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, a flicker of resolve remained. The truth, Michael told himself, was on his side. Somewhere, someone would see it for what it was. And when they did, he vowed not only to clear his name but to fight for justice. For himself and for anyone who had been silenced by prejudice and lies. This was not the end of his story. It was only the beginning of his fight. Michael's ordeal left an indelible mark on him. The false accusations, the humiliation, and the close brush with incarceration had shaken his faith in the justice system and exposed the deep-seated prejudices still ingrained in society. Yet, amid the trauma, Michael's spirit remained unbroken. Instead of succumbing to despair, he found within himself a powerful resolve, a determination to create positive change not only for himself but for others who faced similar injustices. He knew the path ahead would not be an easy one. The fight against racism and prejudice would demand sustained effort, unyielding commitment, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But Michael also knew he wasn't alone. The support of those who believed in him, those who had risked their own reputations to stand by his side, became a source of strength. They reminded him that even in the darkest moments, there were people willing to fight for what was right. As Michael reflected on his experience, he felt a cautious optimism for the future. The injustice he had endured had ignited a fire within him, a desire to use his voice and his story to inspire others and foster a more equitable society. He resolved to transform his pain into purpose, to channel his frustration and grief into action. Each passing day strengthened his commitment to the cause of racial justice, making it the driving force behind his every step. Initially, the aftermath of the ordeal was overwhelming. Michael grappled with a whirlwind of emotions: anger at being falsely accused, sadness over the betrayal by strangers, and a lingering sense of vulnerability. Yet these feelings were tempered by moments of profound gratitude. He reflected on the bystanders who had come forward, risking their own comfort to ensure the truth was revealed and justice prevailed. Their courage reminded him of the importance of empathy and the power of collective action. It was in the moments following his exoneration, when the charges were dropped and his name was cleared, that Michael made a solemn vow. He would dedicate his life to combating the systemic biases that had nearly destroyed him. This newfound purpose fueled his journey. Michael began speaking publicly about his experience, sharing his story with anyone willing to listen. At community events, rallies, and town halls, he painted a vivid picture of the injustices he had faced, urging his audience to confront the systemic racism woven into the fabric of society. His words struck a chord, resonating deeply with those who had endured similar hardships. Michael's story became a beacon of hope, a living testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of collective advocacy. Traveling across the country, Michael became deeply immersed in the civil rights movement. He encountered the raw pain of others who had been denied justice, their stories echoing his own. The frustration and disillusionment of those marginalized by the system were palpable, yet they also reinforced his sense of kinship with their struggles. Despite the adversity he witnessed, Michael's resolve only grew stronger. He knew the road ahead would be long and grueling, but he remained steadfast in his mission, to inspire others and ignite a movement that would outlive him. Through his tireless efforts, Michael emerged as a respected figure within the civil rights community. His name became synonymous with the fight for justice and equality. He formed alliances with other activists and organizations, working collaboratively to enact tangible change. Whether lobbying for legislative reforms or organizing grassroots campaigns, Michael poured every ounce of his energy into addressing the systemic racism that had once threatened his freedom. His advocacy extended beyond speeches and rallies. Michael became a mentor to young people, empowering them to use their voices to affect change. He encouraged them to draw strength from their experiences and to channel their pain into action. Watching the next generation rise to the challenge filled him with hope and reinforced his belief in the power of collective resilience. Michael's efforts bore fruit over time. Policies aimed at dismantling systemic racism began to gain traction, and communities once silenced found their voices amplified. Yet he never lost sight of the personal toll his journey had taken. The emotional scars of his ordeal lingered, a constant reminder of the work still left to do. But rather than allowing those scars to hold him back, Michael viewed them as a source of strength, a testament to his survival and a symbol of his commitment to creating a more just world. Looking back on that fateful day at the pool, Michael felt a complex mix of emotions. The pain and betrayal remained raw, but they were overshadowed by a profound sense of gratitude and purpose. He understood that his story, though deeply personal, was not unique. Countless others had faced similar injustices and many still endured them. This realization only deepened his commitment to the fight for racial equality. Michael's journey was one of resilience and transformation. He had taken the darkest chapter of his life and turned it into a catalyst for change. His unwavering determination inspired those around him, proving that even in the face of immense adversity, the human spirit could triumph. As the years passed, Michael's influence continued to grow. His story became a rallying cry for justice, a reminder that one voice, when raised with conviction, could ignite a movement. Though the road was long and arduous, Michael never wavered. He remained a beacon of hope in a world yearning for change, a testament to the power of empathy, courage, and collective action. His legacy was not merely one of survival but of relentless pursuit of justice and the unwavering belief that even in the darkest moments, a brighter, more equitable future was possible.